Hello, my name is Charles Plord, and you've received this video as part of a documentary series that I'm making. Is man a truly unique creature in the universe, or is he merely a glorified ape, which came about through a long series of lucky lotto wins, which defy all known mathematical odds and logic? This is a question which we really have to ask ourselves in modern times, given what we are told in very prominent television shows and movies. In public schools all over the world, children are being taught that there is no specific purpose for their existence, that we are all just a product of lucky accidents which stretch back about 15 or 17 billion years ago, depending on who you're getting your information from, because that timeline is being pushed back constantly. And we are told similarly on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, in movies, again, television, and many other outlets, that we are living in an extremely old universe and on a very old planet, about 4 to 5 billion years old, which itself has no real purpose for being here, and again is the result of repeated lotto wins and lucky accidents. Along these lines, we're told that all plants and animals are the result of former, more primitive plants and animals, changing into the present variety over long periods of time. According to the official state-funded narrative taught in textbooks and on television programs all over the world, these changes have resulted in a steadily increasing and more beneficial gene code in today's plants, animals, and humans. So right from the beginning, I want to tell you that I will be presenting my findings on these topics from a biased point of view, which begins with a particular presupposition, or that is an already existing belief system. And it's one which I feel explains reality in a vastly more believable way than is presently seen in school textbooks and popular television programs. Some may criticize me for having a bias, but it's true that we all have a bias on this issue, as with all other issues. We all have a certain bias towards certain information, which we develop over a lifetime. We receive information, and information comes into the mind, and we make decisions about information based on what we've been taught formerly, and those things which we have accepted as true formerly. And so that's the filtering process which everyone goes through in terms of how they define what is true or untrue. But what this video presentation seeks to do is to challenge and systematically disassemble the currently dominant view of reality, which states that everything which exists is the result of random chance and mathematically impossible accidents. But within that constructed framework of assumptions, I will now make the following points. This is a standard evolutionary worldview, and most people don't even know what that really states within its own construct, and so I will now tell you what officially the explanation of reality is based on that worldview. The theory of evolution tells us that love is not real, and that may come as a surprise to some people because even atheists believe that they can love someone, but their belief system doesn't really allow for them to believe that, and I'll explain why later. But the theory of evolution does tell us that love is not real, it's only imagined, and that it is merely a useful tool to promote the systematic evolutionary process that man has no real purpose for being here, because purpose would then demand that an intelligence would have caused things, because purpose comes from a cause, and a cause ultimately leads back to intelligence at some point. This view also says that man has started out as a lucky accident from a long and tiresome series of other lucky accidents which defy all known mathematical odds of chance and logic. And some of you watching this now may say to yourself, well, this guy is going to present a lot of information on the debate between creation and evolution. And actually, that's not what I'm going to present. What I am going to present is secular information, that is non-biblical information, which nevertheless points to the Bible, even though the information has nothing to do with the Bible. And it has nothing to do with religion, it has really nothing to do with any spirituality of any sort, and also has nothing to do with atheism or evolution. And you're going to ask yourself, well, how is it possible that information like that exists? Well, I assure you it does exist, and I'm going to be showing that to you in this film series. But basically, the theory of evolution would tell us that all of these lotto wins, which I described earlier, which eventually gets us to a point in time that we're at now presently, would state within that worldview that all of the lotto wins, all of the luck that had to kind of bring things along the evolutionary process, was gradually found to have turned a caveman, well, first an ape-like creature, to a caveman, kind of like a half-ape or a real low intelligence human, into a modern human about 100,000 years ago. That's the currently existing view of how humans came to be human. And at this point, the ape creature would be called a Homo sapien, a wise man. However, the evolutionary theory does not explain to us how the previously mentioned lotto wins were possible, or how they could produce DNA, or a gradually increasing complexity within existing DNA. Because there has never been observed anywhere in science a situation where DNA has become more complex. We only witness the loss of information from DNA as new species of the same kind of animal arise from parents who were genetically superior and therefore more complex in the past. DNA itself is an extremely complex instruction code, authored and written in a mathematical language. To believe that this written code or language could happen by accident, would require that you either be indoctrinated into such a belief system beforehand, or merely that you would have to recite and memorize such a belief system and simply ignore all of the odds, the mathematical odds. Modern computers work using 2-bit code, an instructional language based on mathematics, which uses ones and zeros. This simple code is complex enough to quantify everything from text to software to videos and music in the form of numbers read by that computer. We all know how many different millions or billions of things can be done with computers using just the numbers 1 and 0. And it's truly amazing how this can be done. However, the DNA programming language found in the human genome is based on a 4-bit code. So it's twice as complex, and it's both a linguistic and mathematical code. represented by the letters TGAC. That's commonly how the genetic code is represented in its written form, rather than just showing the actual material of DNA itself. It's going to be represented by TGAC. In other words, human DNA is composed of both an alphabet and a numeric expression of those letters. It is impossible for this to happen by accident, in my view, just as a book doesn't get written all by itself, and math problems do not solve themselves. The complexity of DNA and its instructional code will be addressed in more detail at a later time. For now, what I'm actually going to do is kind of clue you in on some ancient texts that have nothing to do with the Bible in their own form, but nevertheless they serve to complement what the Bible says. And the reason I'm talking about this is because, again, as I said, I have a pre-existing bias which was formed over time and is really based upon things that I've studied over the past 11 years or so. And so I'd like to talk about that for just a moment. But I think that by the time you get done watching this video, you're going to see that maybe some of my views aren't as strange as some people would have you to believe. So for the past 11 years, I've been reading and studying the Bible, and during that time I have also briefly studied some of the religions and beliefs of the ancient world. And while I do not believe those other religious traditions, I have nevertheless noticed many interesting and little-known details. What I'm about to share with you is the result mostly of what some might call dumb luck, having stumbled across a book which inspired me to take the examinations which I read in there further than the author himself has done. And this examination will have much to do with genealogy, ancient genealogies, specifically the genealogies of the famous Noah of the Bible and his 3 sons. I will attempt to show in whatever way I can the gradual descent of nations, which are known today, from these 3 men, the sons of Noah. This sort of information is actually lacking in the mainstream and is rarely touched upon, either in secular studies or religious studies. And so this is one of the reasons that I first became interested in this area of research. While I fully believe all that the Bible has to say about every topic it addresses, what I will attempt to do here is only show that the Bible is extremely reliable, inasmuch as it describes to us individuals who were instrumental in establishing every human civilization after a global flood. My estimation is that after having listened to what I say here, you will not easily forget what you've heard. And even if you still reject the Bible and its claims, I still think that you're going to retain this information. I believe that I have discovered in the religions and recently unearthed archaeological sites of the ancient world an unintentional and indirect confirmation of what the Bible specifically records as being the events of the beginning of the world and human culture, and how religions grew up and formed themselves in ancient times. A history which claims to be the true account of these events directly from God himself, and which predates all ancient religions. According to the Bible, its own information predates itself. So, in order to research all of this, we have to go into the ancient world, and that's what I'm going to attempt to do with this video. So, of that information presented in the ancient world through various texts and clay tablets and cuneiform writing and these sorts of things. One of the claims is that, from the Bible at least, is that all the nations of the world are ultimately descended from Noah's three sons, named Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the subsequent generations of men and women which in turn descended from them in the passing of time. In fact, this is a very reasonable account given the math involved in understanding the topic. If evolution were true, then we would have a much larger world population by now. But according to the Bible, our current population is to be expected if what the Bible actually claims to be true is true. If it is indeed true that Noah's three sons are the progenitors, that is, the starting point of all current human civilization and populations today, then we could reasonably expect that Noah's sons and some of their earliest descendants would be memorialized by their later descendants by means of systems of religion and the naming of certain cities and nations and tribes in their honor, as a way of memorializing their importance in the key events of early human history, even if the details of those events had been largely forgotten and replaced over time by mythology and pagan practices. It is with this worldview, this presupposition, that I have, keeping in mind that it's a presupposition based on the Bible, which then would state the Bible is true and accurate in its description of the creation of the first man, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, where they lived until they had sinned against God, the global flood during the lifetime of a man named Noah, about 4,350 years ago, and the cultural and geological impact which these world events would have had on the people and the planet Earth. Taking all of these things into consideration, I want to now make the following observations about ancient cultures. But first, before we do that, I have to explain to you what was a common view of religion in the ancient world, namely polytheism. And so poly means many, like as in polyester, okay? So poly means many. And then theism is the study of and about God. So polytheism would be the study of and about many gods, okay? So polytheism is the worship of many gods and goddesses. That was very common in the ancient world. Though traditional archaeology commonly attributes the first civilizations of Mesopotamia and Sumer as being the originators of polytheism, what is curiously absent from modern archaeology and scholarship on the topic of ancient religions is how polytheism first came about and what were the reasons that it even came into existence. How would you get a bunch of people evolving from apes to cavemen of low intelligence to people of modern intelligence? All of a sudden, from out of nowhere, they have all of these gods that they worship, whereas before they didn't do that, according to evolution. Now, if you have a biblical worldview, it's very, very easy to understand all of that, which I'll explain later. But for right now, let's look at this from the evolutionary perspective and try and explain things. So I'm going to present to you, based on these questions that come up, I'm going to present to you the point of view that I have. And you as the viewer simply will consider or reject what I'm saying. Now, With my previously mentioned bias and presupposition in mind, which tends towards the Bible being true, the likely reason that polytheism existed in ancient cultures such as Sumer, Egypt, and India may well be that the ancient people of those geographical locations actually first began to merely honor their ancestors for their various triumphs and accomplishments, as we might do today with such figures as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. They were great people of the past, and we remember them for great things that they did. What I suggest happened in addition to this is that the people of those nations also eventually began outright worship of those ancestors due to the passage of time and an ignorance of the fact that these were once real living people, whose life histories later became embellished with mysticism and fantasy by their descendants, who had not immediately written down the true histories of these ancestors while they were yet alive. Therefore, to explain their civilizations and the appearance of man in the earth, these earliest of human cultures would have substituted real history with an oral tradition, mingled with legends and cultural stories, and some of which still contained the likenesses of the actual names of those ancestors and some of the actual events of their lives, later distorted by storytellers and religious leaders. In fact, I might venture to say that if it were not for the fact that we here in modern times in America have written histories about the first European settlers in North America and written histories about America's founders, that enough time has now passed that false legends and embellished stories might also have been widely circulated by now. With this comparative example in mind, one can begin to understand how polytheistic traditions would begin to arise in the ancient world where, in large part, no writing existed, and how, therefore, the oral records of mortal men and women might eventually be transformed into myths of gods and goddesses in the mind of their distant descendants, and then later written down as the myths of Greek and Egyptian pagan idolatry that we know today. So those would have come from oral traditions that existed among those people at an earlier time, which I am saying were based upon people who actually lived at one point in time and later developed into the different religions. So, following this line of thoughts, I want to take our first examination and apply it to the Greek deities of the ancient world. Stated otherwise, I believe that the ancient Greek gods and goddesses refer indirectly to the creation of the world just as it is related in the Bible, and the very first persons who existed at the beginnings of time, whose true identities had been obscured by the time that the ancient Greeks formulated their polytheistic religious traditions. In ancient Greek mythology, it was chaos which was the first thing that existed. Chaos was seen as the impersonal primeval void, a shapeless mass, which later became the earth and the rest of the universe. This directly mirrors what the Bible tells us about how God created the earth. For Genesis 1, verse 2, tells us that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Meaning that though God had created a great space filled with darkness and the waters from which he would eventually form the earth, he had not yet given a definite form to any of it at that point. So here you have the ancient Greeks telling about a world which was unformed before anything existed. And the Bible says the same thing. And then you have the ancient Greeks talking about after that, directly after that, you have the light god and dark god, who then come into existence from chaos. And then you have, in the Bible, God creating light. So what I'm suggesting here is that the Bible's account of creation is really how it occurred. But I also suggest that God told these things to the first man he created, Adam, who then told them to his own children, who then passed down the account to their children, which eventually would have included Noah, who then told it to his children, and so on. And you can see how the progression would continue from one generation to the next. After the global flood, there would have been more to tell. And so the account of the flood would have also been an important story to Noah's earliest descendants, and it is possible that at times the details of the creation and the global flood were combined by people who were far removed from those events and did not see those events firsthand, and had not been told about them directly from people who could be eventually traced back to those events. As such, the ancient Greeks would have had remaining in their earliest culture bits and pieces of this oral tradition of the creation of the earth in memory, and they still had enough of the story to base their gods and goddesses upon it. It is with this theory in mind that I now present the following observations. Ancient Greek deities come in three basic varieties, called the primordial deities, the Titans, and the Olympians. Most people have heard of the Olympians. The Greek primordial deities share some characteristics of Adam and Eve and their immediate descendants, which we learn about in the Bible. But in ancient Greek mythology, the primordial deities, such as Gaia and Uranus, were produced from the previously mentioned chaos, and are the group from which all other deities descended, just as all men have descended from Adam and Eve. And it's important to mention that Gaia was the female deity, and Uranus was the male deity, the first of the primordial gods they were. So if my theory about the development of Earth's earliest religious traditions and the gods and goddesses found in them is correct, then the deities known as the Titans, which descended from these primordial deities, which I mentioned just a moment ago, probably represent the descendants of Adam and the great men of renown, which Genesis 6 tells us existed before the global flood of Noah. Great warriors and living legends even in their own time for their exploits. Following this line of thought, the Olympians who lived on Mount Olympus in Greek mythology may have actually been indirect representations of Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, along with their descendants, because they would have been remembered by later generations as having come down from the mountains of Ararat in modern-day Turkey, where the Bible tells us that the Ark of Noah came to rest after the flood, just as the ancient Greek mythologies tell us that the Olympians lived on Mount Olympus and they came down from the mountain from time to time. This is why I speculate that the reason that the Greek mythology has three separate classes of gods and goddesses is because, according to the biblical narrative, there were three separate and genealogically important events which happened in the earliest eras of human history, namely the creation of Adam and Eve and the population of the earth by their children, reflected in the Greek primordial gods. Then you have the growth of civilization and subsequent wars and warriors coming forth from this, and this would be reflected in the Greek Titans, And then you have the establishment of the world by Noah and his sons following a huge flood, a global flood, and they came down off of the mountain after the flood. And so this could be reflected in the Greek Olympians of Mount Olympus. So it's also worth noting that the Greek mythologies tell us that a race of giants existed during the time of the Titans, which of course corroborates what the Bible tells us about the time prior to the global flood in the 6th chapter of Genesis. For the text tells us that there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Let us now look at Egyptian paganism and deification of the pharaohs in ancient Egypt. After Sumer, Egypt is the closest early civilization to the global flood event, according to the biblical timeline of world history. In fact, after the brief mentioning of small pockets of civilization which developed after the flood near the mountains of Ararat in the general area of ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia, the next places that are mentioned as presumably the first human settlements after the Tower of Babel are the ancient city of Ur and the nation of ancient Egypt, both well known today for their wealth and extremely old archaeological information. Upon further examination, it would seem that the earliest Egyptian cultures sprang up directly following the flood, perhaps a few hundred years or so after. It is entirely possible, then, that the Egyptian god Atum, A-T-U-M, is the remembrance of Adam, Noah, and God collectively. So all three are meshed into one deity known as Atum to the ancient Egyptians. Atum's name means to finish, which is interesting because God finished his creation with Adam. Now, this might refer again to the fact that the Bible records for us that God finished his creation of the universe by creating the first man, Adam. And I see that this is reflected, at least in the name of the Egyptian god Atum, because his name means to finish. In the original Hebrew language of the Old Testament of the Bible, the Hebrew pronunciation of Adam's name sounds very similar to that of the Egyptian pronunciation of the Egyptian god Atum. In other words, in both languages, both names sound almost identical. And I think it's because Adam was a real person, and the Egyptian god Atum is based upon the memory which the ancient Egyptians had of him. What I am therefore suggesting is that the story of Adam's creation by God was passed down by Noah and his sons to their descendants, who eventually, some of them ended up in Egypt in later generations, and I'll show that later. And by that time, they could not remember the story as it had originally been told by Noah and his sons, but they still had some of the more pertinent details of Adam and his creation by God, even down to his very name. As was seen in ancient Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology also contains, within its account of the creation of the earth, that it began with water, just as we see in the Bible. The Egyptian god Atum came forth from a mound of earth, which rose up from the water, just as the Bible tells us that God created earth underwater and caused it to rise out afterwards. And the Bible also tells us that Noah's Ark came to rest on a mountain which rose from the water as the waters of the flood retreated back under the earth's crust and into big pools that we call aquifers and oceans today. The biblical Adam is also the father of mankind, just as the Egyptian god Atum was said to be. Adam came from the earth in the day that God created him, and was also the father of mankind, just as Atom came from the earth mound out of the watery chaos. Atom created all things by speaking them into existence, just as the God of the Bible created all things by speaking them into existence. The biblical man Adam also named all of the animals, and these would all seem to be a series of incredible coincidences if they are not in fact a fragmented remembrance of God, Adam, and Noah amongst the earliest Egyptians, collectively preserved, however, imperfectly in their religious traditions. In ancient Egypt, a ben was a pyramidal-shaped stone or structure which was said to represent the earth mound, which rose from the water from which the formerly mentioned Egyptian god Atum came forth. The curious thing about the ben is that it is the shape of a pyramid, and a pyramid is also the shape of a mountain. According to the Bible, Noah and his sons came down from the mountains of Ararat and would have told the tale of the flood to their descendants, which eventually became paganized through time as the people turned away from God and instead began to worship the memory of the flood, Noah, and his sons, giving birth to the Egyptian pantheon of gods and goddesses who all, curiously enough, have a lot to do with those individuals whom the Bible states existed before the global flood. And I'll show that here in just a moment. It is interesting to note that the Egyptian word for flood is Nu, and might possibly be a reference to Noah's name. Some might be quick to point out that Nu sounds somewhat like it might refer to the Nile. But this is unlikely, since the ancient Egyptian word for the Nile was Itiru. Sounds nothing like the word Nu. And that word Itiru means river, which sounds nothing like the word flood, or that is, Nu. So, meanwhile, Noah's name does sound more or less in English as it does in the pages of the original Hebrew text of the Bible, which sounds like the Egyptian word for flood. And that word again in ancient Egypt was pronounced Nu. So you have Noah, and then you have the ancient Egyptian word for flood called Nu. So in other words, the ancient Egyptian word for flood sounds very much like Noah's name given to us in the Bible. Continuing to follow my theory of ancient man being well aware of the biblical narrative, which had not been written down yet, but nonetheless was the true history of the world, the ben would have served as a reminder of the ancient gods who came down from the mountain and created the world. Because again, remember, the ben does serve to commemorate the earth mound that came up out of the water, which is exactly what the mountain that the ark landed on would have done. It would have been a mountain that came up out of the water as the flood waters receded away. Okay, and so it would have also served as a reminder of the ancient gods who came from the mountain and then later created the world, which is exactly how we might expect the descendants of Noah and his family to be remembered by a people who had turned away from and lost touch with the God whom Noah had worshipped. See, the awareness of the creation of the first man and woman by God and the following watery catastrophe by the earth's earliest inhabitants is also perhaps why the pharaohs would build pyramids or symbolic earth mounds and mountains, and why they were worshipped as gods, because they were seen as the embodiments of the gods who first became descended from the Egyptian god Atum, the god of the earth mound, which rose from the waters of chaos at the beginning of the world. Therefore, as the embodiment of those gods who came after him, they must have a mountain built to themselves in honor of their godhood, commemorating Atum's earth mound. Now I'd like to do a more in-depth study of the Egyptian gods and goddesses, and I will make comparisons between what the Bible says about the first people who existed and what these very, very first gods of the really far back ancient Egypt, what was taught about them. And actually, most of these gods and goddesses do date back to about 2000 or 2200 BC, and sometimes even a little bit farther back than that, which is when the Bible tells us the global flood would have happened. So shortly thereafter, you have these stories of these gods and goddesses in ancient Egypt coming about. So let's just take notice of that as I describe these different gods and goddesses. The Egyptian goddess Hathor is a woman who is featured with a snake, just as Eve is in the Bible. She is also the owner of a tree of life, just as there is featured in the Bible a tree of life in the Garden of Eden where Eve lived. Like the goddess Wadjet, Hathor protects women who are giving birth, just as Eve presumably would have been a coach and a sort of mentor to her daughters and granddaughters during their deliveries. So Eve would have been associated with a snake in retellings of the Garden of Eden. And hey, Grandma, Grandpa, how did we get here? Well, let me tell you a story about how we came to exist. And so, that story of Adam and Eve being created would have been told. You would have had a woman being created from the rib of a man, which is actually scientifically pretty trustworthy, that account, because a man contains both the X and Y chromosomes in his DNA, and the X and Y chromosomes determine sex or gender, and a woman only contains two X chromosomes. So a man with his DNA can make a woman because he contains both chromosomes, but a woman can't make a man. Just an interesting piece of information for you there. So also, like Hathor, the Egyptian goddess Wadjet is also associated with the snake, just as Eve was associated with a snake in the Garden of Eden. The snake in question is featured on a uraeus, or headpiece, which was worn as a crown by the ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses and also the pharaohs. The uraeus sometimes features one snake, two snakes, or even three snakes, and it seems that no Egyptologist can settle on the ultimate significance of the snake and why Egyptian goddesses and pharaohs seem to display this so prominently. But I'm going to offer my own guess at its purpose. I've heard that in many cultures, even from ancient times, the snake was, and even today, is still seen as a guardian, and that these same cultures often employed secrecy in their religious practices of knowledge and knowledge of building, which seems to have had religious importance as well. I would suggest that the serpent is the protector of the sacred knowledge, just as the serpent who deceived Eve tempted her with secret knowledge. I would further suggest that there were those in ancient Egypt who were fully aware of this story as having originated at the world's beginning as a real and historical event, and that this is why they chose the symbol of the snake to act as a protector of secret knowledge. As with Hathor, Wadjet is also associated with protecting women in childbirth, which, again, Eve herself probably would have done that for her daughters and granddaughters. We can expect that. As the first woman to know the pains of childbirth herself, the Bible tells us, she would have no doubt served as a guide to her own daughters and granddaughters when they delivered their children, and been offering reassurances to them and coaching them on certain things to ease the pain and so forth. So this memory of her then would have eventually been perverted through paganized idolatry, and then you get these goddesses in ancient Egypt that seem to have a lot to do with Eve. A third Egyptian goddess, Jusaset, has a uraeus with the ever-popular and mysterious snake, again, and she is associated with the acacia tree. So here we have another goddess who is associated with a snake, and she also has a tree, the acacia tree, which was known as the tree of life. Further, she is considered to be the mother of all Egyptian deities. So she's the mother goddess, and Eve was the mother of all living, the Bible tells us. So here we have another female goddess who is associated with a snake and a tree, and who is seen as the grandmother of all deities, just as Eve would have been known and recognized by her earliest descendants as their own grandmother. These goddesses seem undoubtedly to be references to the first woman Eve, though the corridors of time have blemished the original history when the ancient Egyptians began to worship Jusaset. Another Egyptian goddess called Nut is married to her brother Geb. She originates in the creation story Heliopolis, and like Eve, is often depicted as being nude. She is also sometimes depicted as a sow with many suckling piglets, representing motherhood. And here again we find a coded reference to Eve, type of symbolism, as Eve was nude in the garden with Adam and was the mother of all and was married to Adam, who technically and biologically speaking would have been the equivalent of her brother, just as Geb was the brother of the goddess Nut. The Egyptian god Ra created objects by means of his tears and sweat, which quite possibly seems to be a reference to Adam's curse, wherewith God cursed him after he and Eve had sinned, wherein Adam toiled greatly with tears and sweat to raise crops for himself and his family as punishment for sinning against God. The text of the Bible reads thusly as God pronounces his judgment upon Adam. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. And thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. In like manner, in Egyptian mythology, mankind rebels against Ra, which may possibly be a reference to Adam and Eve's rebellion against God. Ra creates animals by speaking their secret names, and this may have to do with Adam naming the animals in the Garden of Eden, and with God creating by speaking, as we observed in Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 through 20. And the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him. And what that means is that there was not found a helper for Adam which would meet his need to reproduce and fill the earth with people. So in other words, Adam didn't want to marry any of the animals which God had created. So at this point, this is where God creates Eve. In addition to this, the Bible tells us that Noah's son, named Ham, had a grandson named Ramah. The time of his existence would have been about the time that Ra first appears in ancient Egyptian religion. The Egyptian god Set may well be a derivative of the Hebrew name Seth, who was one of the sons of Adam and Eve. In fact, in the ancient Greek language, the name of the Egyptian god Set is rendered as Seth. And as it is, there is no record from Egyptologists as to the origin of the name of the god Set. So they're at a loss there. And in ancient Egyptian mythology, there is a struggle which ensues between Set and another Egyptian god named Osiris. And in that story, Osiris is killed by Set. And I'm going to suggest that this may have been confused with the story of Cain and Abel that is told to us in the Bible in the third chapter, or rather the fourth chapter of Genesis. And in that story, Cain, one of the sons of Adam and Eve, kills his brother Abel, and then he goes on to build a city. The Egyptians, I'm going to suggest, they knew something about that, but by the time they lived in Egypt, much of that story had been forgotten or corrupted to some degree. And so here you have Set killing Osiris. It is said that in the founding of Rome, there were two brothers, Romulus and Remus, and they had a series of contests and so forth. And eventually what happens is that Romulus kills Remus and then builds the city of Rome. And so that very closely mirrors what the biblical narrative would have said about Cain and Abel. Two brothers fight, one kills the other, and then the one that wins, after he murders his brother, goes and builds a city. So that's interesting. But I want to just take a moment here to reflect on what I've talked about so far. And you may not be convinced yet that the things I've been talking about have anything to do with the Bible. Maybe you're saying to yourself, well, this guy is just imagining a lot of connections between real history and some of these ancient pagan religions having somehow to do with people remembering things that happened at the beginning of civilization, the beginning of the world, as the Bible would tell it. Well, there's going to be more information that I'm going to present, and actually it's going to be a lot stronger evidence than what I've shown here. And maybe you've never thought about where the name of the ancient nation of Assyria came from. Maybe you've never thought about how the Median Empire of the Medes, how it got its name. And maybe you don't know why there are so many places in the Bible that tell you that a certain person lived a certain number of years and he had sons and daughters and so forth, and then he dies. And maybe you don't know why there are so many names listed in the Bible and their genealogies. I'm actually going to show you in the next video presentation why I believe there are those names presented there, at least one of the reasons for that. And I'm going to show you very compelling evidence that the earliest people in Mesopotamia and Sumer were descended from the very people whom the Bible talks about. But to reflect and conclude on what we've seen so far, and what we will continue to see, is that each group of people who descended from Noah's sons spread themselves abroad after the global flood and the dispersal of the Tower of Babel. And they also carried with them the names, the stories, and identities of their ancestors, who are mentioned uniquely in the Bible and nowhere else. The more distant descendants of Noah's three sons wove fanciful stories and mythologies around the memory of their forebears as they forgot more and more of the original histories of those people, largely for a lack of writing and perhaps time to write. After all, in the first few hundred years after a global flood, you would have to reinvent technology and follow herds of animals around for food. And there probably was not very much time for writing until the people finally stumbled upon seeding plants and they were able to cultivate them. And by doing so, they were able then to build settlements and a working civilization. And that is what we find actually to be true, even in secular studies of history. As soon as the earliest civilizations were established, it was they who wrote and made a record of their presence in the nations which they settled. And really, it's only then that we begin to see the type of religious stories which were told about a world before the Great Flood, the flood itself, and then the earliest people who existed thereafter. All persons who had been forgotten by the time the stories about them, or that is what remained of those original stories, was finally being recorded in a written form. See, prior to that, it would have just been oral tradition. You know, grandma and grandpa tell the story to their grandchildren, and then they grow up and they tell it to their children and their grandchildren and so on. And over time, of course, the story of what grandma, great-great-great-great-great-grandma and grandpa did after they got off the boat, of course, that would change over time because no one was writing it down. People were just telling it by oral tradition. And so you can expect that eventually the story and the account is going to change. People are going to forget what it was really all about, and all of a sudden, people that stepped off the boat are going to be thought of very differently. They might even be thought of as gods, especially since the Bible tells us that Noah and his sons lived very, very long time. They had very long lifespans. So someone who lives a couple hundred years or so, to people who don't live that long, they would seem to be immortal. And so you could see how easily certain legends would crop up around those people, and how largely what really happened in the lives of those people would be distorted, but there'd still be certain key elements that would remain, which is what I've tried to show you here in this video. You know, as soon as those earliest civilizations were established, and people then began to write things down, you know, before then it was probably just a struggle to stay alive. And the stories about the beginning of the world would be told around campfires, based on what some old man amongst everybody in the wandering group of people could actually remember about what his own grandfather had told him when he was a little boy, you see. And if that man was killed in an attack by enemy forces, or he became ill, or he drowned while trying to cross a river, fell off of a cliff, ate a poisonous plant, you know, maybe was attacked by a lion or something like that, why, his story and all of the details would die with him. And nobody would hear about Grandpa's stories about the beginning of the world in the Great Flood and so on, because Grandpa would be dead, you see. And in a situation like that, you can understand again how the original history of a world as related by the Bible would get lost very quickly until writing was finally being used. There are many more interesting things which I plan to show you in this video series. So if you're not convinced yet of the things that I'm saying, I think in the next video presentation you'll be trying to pick your jaw up off the floor, because you're going to see some very, very strong evidence that the genealogies that are found in the Bible are actually records of real living people, and the names of nations and peoples that are known to archaeology today, they're just literally all over the place, are actually derived from names that are first found in the Bible, which I suggest were real living people. And for example, the nation of Assyria, the ancient people of the Assyrian Empire, and then also a ancient city called Akkad, which then the Akkadians are also a derivative of that name. You find those in the Bible first, and they were the names of people who are in the Bible. And I'm going to show you that in the next video presentation, which is called Biblical Genealogies Revealed.